Everything must go. Those three words appeared on the windows of 567 Circuit City stores over 60 days in late 2008. And as customers finally got the discounts they'd always wanted, 34,000 employees watched their company die in plain sight, not from fraud, not from Amazon, not from some competitor's masterstroke, but from a single decision made the year before. When Circuit City's executives looked at the most knowledgeable sales force in American retail and decided it was too expensive, fired 3,400 of their best people to save a few dollars an hour, and guaranteed the ending you already know. Richmond, Virginia, 1949. Samuel Wurtzel had not planned to become a retail pioneer. He was 33 years old, working as a real estate attorney, when he drove past a construction site and noticed something unusual: a television antenna being installed on a house in a neighborhood that didn't have a television station. He stopped the car. The nearest TV broadcast signal was in Washington, D.C., roughly 100 miles north. The family installing the antenna was paying substantial money for equipment to receive a signal that barely reached them, transmitted across terrain that degraded the picture to something between snow and suggestion. And they were doing it because they needed to be part of something new. Wurtzel understood that feeling. He also understood that he was looking at an industry in its infancy, a technology that was about to transform American domestic life as completely as the automobile had transformed American geography. He was early. Not a year early, not 5 years early. He was early in the way that matters, early enough that there was no established playbook, no dominant competitor, no proven format to copy. He opened Ward's company on October 2nd, 1949. The name came from a combination of his initials, S. Wurtzel, Ward's, and a desire for something that sounded established, trustworthy, permanent. The store sold television sets in a city where almost nobody had one yet, using a financing model that let working-class families spread payments over time. It was, in retrospect, a simple idea. At the time, it was radical. The Richmond of 1949 was a mid-sized southern city, proud of its history, cautious about its future, and deeply uncertain about the post-war economic landscape. Wurtzel was selling optimism, packaged in a wooden cabinet with a round screen. He was selling the future on installment payments. What defined Samuel Wurtzel, and what his company would both inherit and eventually misunderstand, was a peculiar combination of aggression and patience. He expanded when others waited. He hired specialists when competitors used generalists. He paid salespeople commissions that were generous enough to attract ambitious people and structured carefully enough to reward genuine knowledge. A Ward's salesperson who didn't know the technical difference between television sets was a Ward's salesperson who didn't work at Ward's for long. This was the founding principle: not the cheapest price, not the most convenient location, the most knowledgeable staff. It would take 58 years to fully abandon it. The name changed in 1984. By then, Ward's company had been Circuit City stores for several years. The brand had been introduced in 1961 for a superstore format in Richmond. But the parent company finally unified under the Circuit City name when it went on the New York Stock Exchange. The decision acknowledged what had already happened. This was no longer a local Virginia retailer. It was a national force. The years between 1949 and the mid-1980s are worth understanding not as a prelude, but as a foundation. Because Circuit City's later collapse makes more sense when you see what had actually been built. This wasn't a company that stumbled into success. It was an organization with genuine operational sophistication, developed over decades of disciplined execution. The key strategic insight of the 1960s and 1970s was the superstore format itself. While competitors operated small, cluttered shops where inventory lived in the back and customers waited for salespeople to retrieve products, Circuit City built large showroom floors where merchandise was displayed, demonstrated, and sold by commission employees who had studied it seriously. The experience was different. You walked in knowing roughly what you wanted: a television, a stereo, a car audio system, and you left having had a conversation with someone who could tell you why one model handled a particular technical problem better than another. By 1986, Circuit City was operating 105 stores, generating revenues of over $1 billion. The margins weren't extraordinary. Electronics retail has always been a volume business, but the operational efficiency was. Circuit City's inventory management, at a time when most retailers were doing this manually, was increasingly systematized. The company invested in logistics infrastructure years before supply chain became a management buzzword. Here's the thing about Circuit City's model in its prime years. It worked because it aligned incentives correctly. Salespeople earned real commissions. This meant they studied products, retained customers, and closed sales that actually matched what buyers needed. The company's reputation was built on the sales floor, one transaction at a time. Then the 1990s arrived, and so did Best Buy. In 1983, a man named Richard Schulze converted his Sound of Music chain into something he called Best Buy. The format was different: lower prices, less commission-driven selling, more of a warehouse aesthetic. The theory was that consumers who had become more sophisticated about consumer electronics didn't need expert guidance as much as they needed access to a wide selection at aggressive prices. Best Buy was, for much of the 1980s, a regional Midwest competitor that Circuit City's Richmond headquarters monitored without excessive concern. The big box electronics war was a long-term game, and Circuit City was winning it. By 1994, something had shifted. Best Buy's revenues were growing faster. Its store count was expanding more aggressively. And the format, which Circuit City executives had privately dismissed as unsophisticated, was resonating with exactly the mainstream consumer who didn't want to spend 45 minutes being educated by a commissioned salesperson. What Circuit City missed, initially, was that Best Buy's non-commission model wasn't a weakness. For a significant segment of the market, it was a feature. Customers who felt comfortable making their own decisions, who had done research before entering a store, who found commission salespeople more exhausting than helpful. Those customers were migrating to Best Buy and not coming back. Circuit City's response between 1993 and 1997 was instructive and ultimately insufficient. The company launched CarMax, a used car retail concept that applied Circuit City's no-haggle informed salesperson model to automobiles. CarMax was genuinely innovative. It worked. It grew. It eventually became its own public company. But it was also a distraction. While Circuit City's leadership was thinking about used cars in suburban lots, Best Buy was methodically expanding into Circuit City's core markets. The numbers from 1996 tell the story plainly. Circuit City was operating approximately 600 stores, with revenues of around $5.6 billion. Best Buy had roughly 250 stores, but was growing at a rate that made the gap feel temporary. By 1998, Best Buy's revenues had crossed $8 billion. Circuit City's were $10 billion, but the trajectories had crossed. To put that shift in perspective, within 5 years, a company that Circuit City had watched from a comfortable distance had become an existential competitive threat. The window for a decisive strategic response was closing faster than anyone in Richmond seemed to understand. Between 1998 and 2005, Circuit City made 3 decisions that, taken individually, each had a reasonable business justification. Taken together, they created the conditions for everything that followed. The first decision, in 2000, Circuit City eliminated its appliance business. Refrigerators, washing machines, dishwashers, gone. The reasoning was clear enough. Appliances were low margin, required expensive delivery and installation infrastructure, and created logistics complications that diluted the company's focus. Best Buy didn't sell appliances at the time. Exiting the category seemed like disciplined portfolio management. What Circuit City lost, without fully calculating the cost, was a reason for homeowners to visit its stores. A family moving into a new house needs a refrigerator, a washer, a dryer, an oven. And while they're buying those items, they also buy televisions, stereos, and home theater systems. Appliances drove traffic. Without them, Circuit City needed to find other reasons for customers to walk through the door with high purchase intent. Best Buy, watching Circuit City exit appliances, promptly entered the category. The second decision, Circuit City's real estate strategy in the late 1990s, was conservative. While Best Buy was signing leases in prime suburban locations, the high-traffic corridors near major intersections and new residential development, Circuit City was more selective, more cautious about rent obligations. This fiscal discipline was not unreasonable, but the result, by 2003, was that Best Buy had secured better locations in a significant number of markets. Location in big box retail is not a recoverable disadvantage. Once a competitor occupies the most visible corner of a suburban retail corridor, the second best location becomes permanently second best. The third decision, Circuit City's technology investment plateaued. The company's inventory management systems, which had been genuinely ahead of the industry in the 1980s, were not updated aggressively enough in the late 1990s. By 2002, competitors including Best Buy were implementing supply chain technologies that Circuit City was studying rather than deploying. None of these decisions individually was fatal. Together, they meant that by 2005, Circuit City was competing with Best Buy on price, losing, on location quality, roughly even at best, on store experience, advantage Circuit City but shrinking, and on product selection, roughly equal. The one structural advantage Circuit City still possessed, a sales force that knew its products deeply, was about to become the target of a cost-cutting exercise that would remove it. Alan Wurtzel, Samuel's son, had run Circuit City through its most important growth years. His tenure saw the company expand from a regional chain to a national retailer, develop the CarMax concept, and establish the operational disciplines that made Circuit City genuinely formidable. When Alan Wurtzel stepped back from active management in the 1990s, something changed. Not immediately and not dramatically, but in ways that became apparent only in retrospect. The new leadership generation understood Circuit City as a mature retail business requiring optimization rather than as a sales culture requiring constant investment. This is not an unusual pattern in American corporate history. The founder, or the founder's son, often carries an intuitive understanding of what made the company work that is difficult to translate into quarterly metrics. The management generation that follows frequently knows the financial architecture of the business without fully internalizing the operational philosophy that built it. By 2002, Circuit City's CEO was Alan McCullough. By 2006, Philip Schoonover had taken the position. These were experienced retail executives. What they faced was genuine. A company with a cost structure that was under pressure, a stock price that had been declining, and an activist investor community that was asking pointed questions about efficiency. What they chose was a path that would prove catastrophic. But it's important to understand why it seemed reasonable to the people making the decision. The logic ran as follows. Circuit City's sales force was expensive. Commission structures plus benefits meant that experienced salespeople were earning substantially more than entry-level employees at competitors. If those salespeople were the company's primary competitive advantage, paying them well was justified. But if, and this was the critical assumption, if the consumer electronics customer had become sophisticated enough that expert salespeople no longer provided the differentiated value they once had, then those salaries represented an inefficiency. You were paying premium wages for a service the market no longer valued at a premium. The assumption was wrong. But it was not obviously wrong to the people who held it. The announcement came on a Tuesday in late March. Circuit City was eliminating 3,400 positions. Specifically, the company was terminating employees whose hourly wages were more than a defined threshold above the market rate for their positions. Workers making significantly above the minimum for their job classifications, in other words, the most experienced, most knowledgeable, most effective salespeople, were being let go. They would be replaced by new hires at lower wages. The stated savings, approximately $130 million annually. The market responded positively, initially. Circuit City shares rose on the announcement. Analysts noted that the labor cost reduction was meaningful and that the company's overhead structure needed addressing. The logic of the move, as a pure financial exercise, was legible. What happened inside the stores was something different. The 3,400 employees who received their termination notices were not, in general, the weakest performers. The structure of the cuts specifically targeted high earners, which in a commission environment meant high sellers. These were the people who had been at Circuit City long enough to know every product on the floor, to recognize returning customers, to understand the difference between a buyer who needed guidance and a browser who needed space. Some had been with the company for 10, 15, 20 years. They were replaced, over the following months, by new hires earning lower wages who had not had time to develop product expertise, customer relationships, or the quiet institutional knowledge that distinguishes a good retail salesperson from someone standing near merchandise. Think about that decision for a second. In a business where your primary remaining competitive advantage over Best Buy was the quality of your sales staff, you systematically eliminated the people who embodied that advantage. The $130 million in annual savings became the most expensive cost-cutting measure in Circuit City's history. What you cannot easily calculate is what those salespeople represented in customer retention, repeat business, and average transaction value. Commission structures in retail create salespeople who are extremely good at selling. When you remove them, you discover that the revenue they generated does not automatically transfer to their lower-paid replacements. Sales per square foot at Circuit City had already been declining. After March 2007, the decline accelerated. By the fall of 2007, the quarterly earnings reports were providing unambiguous evidence that the March decision had not produced the intended result. Revenue was declining. Customer satisfaction scores, the company tracked these, were moving in the wrong direction. The new employees were learning, as new employees do, but they were learning on the job in a competitive market that did not offer patience for on-the-job learning. Meanwhile, the macro environment was beginning to deteriorate. The American housing market was cracking. Consumer confidence indices, which track closely with big-ticket electronics purchases, were trending downward. The customers who bought 50-inch televisions and full home theater installations, Circuit City's highest margin transaction category, were exactly the customers who felt the early effects of the credit tightening that preceded the 2008 financial crisis. Best Buy, operating with a different cost structure and having spent years positioning itself for the margin-efficient model, was better positioned for what was coming. This is not entirely fair to Circuit City. No retailer emerges from a severe consumer spending contraction unscathed. But the difference in preparation was real. The parallel with what happened to Sears later, and with what happened to other category killers, who mistook their cost structure for their business model is hard to ignore. The mistake was not specific to Circuit City. It was a pattern. Optimize the metrics, lose the substance. In November 2007, Philip Schoonover announced his resignation as CEO. The board appointed James Markham as interim chief executive. Negotiations with potential buyers, including Best Buy, in a turn of history that has a certain quality of inevitability about it, began and ultimately produced nothing. Circuit City filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on November 10, 2008. The liquidation of Circuit City happened faster than most people expected. Chapter 11 was supposed to be a restructuring, not a death sentence. The company's plan was to close underperforming locations, initially around 155 stores, reduce costs, and emerge as a smaller, more competitive operation. This was the theory. The execution was overtaken by events. The financial markets of late 2008 were not a favorable environment for retail restructuring. The credit that a company in Chapter 11 needs to continue operations, to buy inventory, to pay suppliers, to keep lights on while the restructuring plan is developed, was becoming increasingly expensive and difficult to access. The same crisis that was freezing mortgage markets was freezing the financing mechanisms that distressed retailers depend on. In January 2009, Circuit City's board announced that the company would not successfully restructure. It would liquidate. The announcement triggered the most visible retail death in American history up to that point. Over the following 60 days, 567 stores went through the process that everyone who worked in American retail during that period remembers. The signs, the crowds, the deep discounts, the steadily depleting shelves, the employees answering questions about products they would not have jobs to sell next month. 34,000 people lost their jobs. The employees who had been terminated in March 2007, the 3,400 who had been cut to save $130 million, watched from outside. Some had found new positions. Some had, in another irony that the story seems almost to generate deliberately, gone to work for Best Buy. They brought with them the exact product knowledge and customer service instincts that Circuit City had decided it didn't need to pay for. The liquidation generated approximately $1.3 billion in proceeds, which went to creditors. The Circuit City brand was sold at auction and changed hands several times afterward, used for a brief online retail attempt that produced nothing significant. The name survived the company by years, attached to nothing that resembled what Samuel Wurtzel had built. It is too easy and too inaccurate to explain Circuit City's failure as simply Best Buy won. Best Buy faced the same recession, the same consumer electronics market, the same competitive landscape. Best Buy also came close to failure in the years after 2008. The difference was structural and cultural, and it had been accumulating for a decade before the 2008 crisis provided the final pressure. Best Buy made several decisions in the 2000s that Circuit City did not. It entered appliances, the category Circuit City had abandoned. It invested in its Geek Squad acquisition, creating a services business that produced revenue streams not dependent on transaction volume. It developed relationships with consumer electronics brands, Apple in particular, that gave it product exclusivities and traffic advantages that weren't available to competitors. None of these moves was obviously brilliant in isolation. Together, they created a business that was more diversified, less dependent on any single revenue stream, and better positioned to absorb a consumer spending shock without collapsing. The lesson that Best Buy understood, and Circuit City did not, is about the difference between a retail business and a sales machine. A retail business survives adverse conditions because it has multiple functions: selling, servicing, advising, fulfilling. A sales machine, a company, whose entire value proposition is the quality of its transaction, is fragile precisely because transactions are the first thing that disappear in a downturn. Circuit City, at its best, had been more than a sales machine. The 1990s leadership decisions gradually reduced it to one. On the cost of eliminating your core advantage, the March 2007 layoffs will be studied in business schools for as long as consumer retail is taught. The structural problem wasn't the decision to reduce labor costs. That was a legitimate operational challenge. The problem was that Circuit City's management had confused a cost, experienced salespeople's wages, with an asset, experienced salespeople's capabilities. When you find a way to reduce a cost, you have solved a financial problem. When you eliminate an asset while thinking you're reducing a cost, you have created an operational catastrophe that your quarterly earnings report won't reveal for 2 or 3 quarters. What Best Buy did differently wasn't paying its employees more. It often didn't. Best Buy's model was built around lower commission exposure. The insight was that you design your business around what your employees can actually deliver, rather than assuming your employees will deliver something your cost structure doesn't reward. On the relationship between location and survival, real estate in big box retail is not easily reversible. Circuit City's conservative leasing strategy in the late 1990s, the decision to avoid aggressive expansion in secondary markets when lease rates were favorable, created location disadvantages that became permanent. By 2003, Best Buy had occupied the best positions in enough markets that Circuit City was structurally competing for second-place traffic. The universal version of this principle. In any distribution business, the cost of the best position is always less than the cost of the second best position, because the second best position doesn't produce the revenue that would justify its cost. On the danger of optimizing a declining business, between 2002 and 2007, Circuit City's management was engaged in genuine operational improvement. Costs were reduced. Processes were streamlined. The metrics looked better. What the metrics didn't capture was that the underlying business model was in structural decline, that the competitive advantages which had made Circuit City formidable were eroding while the optimization was occurring. This is perhaps the most transferable lesson from Circuit City's story. Optimization and strategy are different activities, and they can be in direct conflict. A company that is very efficiently doing the wrong thing is moving toward failure faster than a company that is inefficiently doing the right thing. On what happens when culture changes hands? Samuel Wurtzel's founding insight that the customer who buys a television deserves a salesperson who understands television was a cultural commitment that expressed itself in hiring, training, compensation, and store design. It was not simply a policy, it was a value. Values of this kind do not survive through documentation. They survive because the people who hold them make daily decisions that express them. When the leadership generation changes and the new leaders understand the company as a financial structure rather than as a culture, the values begin to erode. The processes remain, the metrics remain, the culture disappears. By 2007, Circuit City's culture of expert selling had been fading for years. The March layoffs did not destroy it. They merely made visible what had already happened. The building at 9950 Malin Drive in Richmond, Virginia, Circuit City's former corporate headquarters, is now occupied by a pharmaceutical research company. The address is the same. The parking lot is the same. The building itself was renovated, but the bones are Circuit City's. If you know what you're looking for, you can see it. Most of the 567 stores are gone. Demolished, repurposed, absorbed into different retail uses. Some became churches, some became fitness centers. A significant number became the thing that the dead mall era specializes in producing: spaces between other spaces, holding on but not quite empty enough to redevelop. Best Buy survived the 2008 recession and still operates, as of this writing, as the dominant consumer electronics retailer in the United States. It has had its own struggles. The rise of Amazon restructured its business as thoroughly as Circuit City restructured itself, and Best Buy's recovery required its own strategic reinvention. But it survived. It adapted. It is still there. Circuit City employed 60,000 people at its peak. Samuel Wurtzel opened one store in 1949 to sell televisions to a city that barely had a signal to receive. 70 years later, the name exists primarily as an answer to trivia questions and a recurring reference point in discussions of retail failure. Here's what this story is actually about. Not adaptation, not disruption, not the inevitable casualties of a changing market. This is a story about what happens when an organization loses faith in the thing that made it matter. Circuit City knew how to sell. It had built an entire culture around the value of knowing your product and your customer. When its leadership decided that this culture was a cost rather than a foundation, the company didn't just cut expenses. It removed the reason it existed. Some companies die because the world changes. Circuit City died because it changed itself.